After the days of Gideon, the Israelites once again started worshipping idols and doing wrong in God's sight. For 40 years, God allowed them to be subject to the Philistines. The Philistines lived along the southern coast and had 5 large cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, Ekron, and Ashdod. Near the Philistine territory, in the town of Zorah, lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They had not been able to have children. One day the angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, "Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon give birth to a son. You must not eat grapes or raisins, drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, or eat any forbidden food. Your son's hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines." When she told her husband Manoah, he prayed, "Lord, please let the man of God come back to us again and give us more instructions about this son who is to be born." The angel of God appeared once again to his wife as she was sitting in the field, but her husband Manoah was not with her, so she went to fetch him. Manoah asked, "When the boy is born, what rules should govern his life?" The angel repeated the instruction he had given to Manoah's wife. "What is your name?" asked Manoah. "It is too wonderful for you to understand," the angel of the Lord replied. Then Manoah took a young goat and a grain offering and offered it on a rock as a sacrifice to the Lord. As the flames from the altar shot up towards the sky, the angel of the Lord ascended in the fire. Manoah and his wife fell with their faces to the ground. Sometime later, the son they had been promised was born. They named him Samson. The Lord blessed Samson as he grew up, and the Spirit of the Lord stirred in him. His hair was not cut, and he did not drink wine or eat forbidden food. One day, when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. He returned home demanding, "I want to marry a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me." His father and mother objected. "Isn't there even one woman in our own tribe or among all the Israelites you could marry?" they asked. "Why must you go to the pagan Philistines to find a wife?" Samson refused to listen to them, demanding the marriage be arranged. As Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. Later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion. He found that a swarm of bees had made some honey in the carcass, and scooped some of the honey into his hands and ate it. Samson threw a party at Timnah, as was the custom for elite young men. The bride's parents selected 30 young men from the town to be his companions. Samson announced, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you solve it during these 7 days of the celebration, I will give you 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. But if you can't solve it, then you must give me 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing." They agreed. Samson put the riddle to them. Out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. 3 days later they were still trying to figure it out. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to explain the riddle for us, or we will burn down your father's house with you in it. Did you invite us to this party just to make us poor?" So Samson's wife came to him in tears and said, "You don't love me. You hate me. You have given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." Samson refused. She kept crying and nagging Samson for the answer for the remainder of the feast. On the last day of the feast, Samson gave in to her pressure and told her the answer. She immediately betrayed him and told the guests. So before sunset on the 7th day, the men of the town came to Samson with their answer. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson replied, "If you hadn't put pressure on my wife to betray me, you wouldn't have solved my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on Samson. He went down to the enemy town of Ashkelon, killed 30 men, took their belongings, and gave their clothing to the men who had solved his riddle. Samson was furious about what had happened, and he went back home to live with his father and mother. His wife was given in marriage to the man who had been Samson's best man at the wedding. Samson left his wedding celebrations to return to his parents. Later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a present of a young goat to his wife. Her father would not let Samson in, and explained, as he thought Samson hated her, he had given her in marriage to his best man. He offered to give Samson another of his daughters in marriage instead. A furious Samson replied, "I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do to you Philistines." Samson went out and caught 300 foxes. He tied their tails together in pairs and fastened a torch to each pair of tails. Then he lit the torches and let the foxes run through the grain fields of the Philistines. Samson burned all their grain to the ground, including the sheaves and the uncut grain. He also destroyed their vineyards and olive groves. "Who did this?" the Philistines demanded. "Samson," was the reply, "because his father-in-law gave Samson's wife to be married to his best man." So the Philistines went and got the woman and her father and burned them to death. When Samson heard what had happened, he vowed, "I won't rest until I take my revenge on you." So he attacked the Philistines with great fury, killing many of them. Then Samson went to live in a cave in the rock of Etam. The Philistines retaliated by setting up camp in Judah and spreading out near the town of Lehi. The men of Judah asked the Philistines, "Why are you attacking us?" The Philistines replied, "We've come to capture Samson and pay him back for what he did to us." So 3,000 men of Judah went down to get Samson at the cave in Etam. They said to Samson, "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us? What are you doing to us?" Samson replied, "I only did to them what they did to me." "We have come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines," the men of Judah said to Samson. When they promised not to kill him, Samson allowed them to tie him up with 2 new ropes. As Samson arrived at Lehi, the Philistines shouted in triumph. But the Spirit of the Lord made Samson so powerful, he snapped the ropes on his arms as if they were burnt strands of flax, and they fell from his wrists. Samson picked up the jawbone of a dead donkey and killed 1,000 Philistines with it. Samson shouted, With the jawbone of a donkey I have piled them in heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey I've killed 1,000 men. The place was named Jawbone Hill. Samson was really thirsty from his efforts, so the Lord caused water to gush from a hollow in the ground at Lehi. Samson judged Israel for 20 years, during the period when the Philistines dominated the land. Some time later, Samson fell in love with a woman called Delilah. Delilah was a Philistine living in the valley of Sorek, near to Samson's hometown of Zorah. The rulers of the Philistines went to Delilah and said, "Entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong and how he can be overpowered. Then each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah asked Samson, "Please tell me what makes you so strong, and what it would take to tie you up securely." Samson replied, "If I were tied up with 7 new bowstrings, I would become as weak as anyone else." The Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 new bowstrings, and she tied Samson up with them. She also hid men in one of the inner rooms of her house. Then she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." But Samson snapped the bowstrings as string snaps when it is burned by a fire. "You've been making fun of me and telling lies," Delilah told Samson. "Now please tell me, how can you be tied up securely?" Samson replied, "If I were tied up with brand new ropes, I would become as weak as anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him up with them. Delilah cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." But again Samson snapped the ropes from his arms as if they were thread. "You've been making fun of me and telling lies. Now tell me how you can be tied up securely," Delilah demanded. Samson replied, "If you were to weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on your loom and tighten it with the loom shuttle, I would become as weak as anyone else." As Samson slept, Delilah wove his hair into her loom, but again Samson broke free. Delilah pouted. "How can you tell me I love you when you don't share your secrets with me? You've made fun of me 3 times now, and you still haven't told me what makes you so strong." Delilah kept nagging Samson until he shared his secret with her. "My hair has never been cut," he confessed, "for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head was shaved, my strength would leave me." Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. The Philistine rulers came with their money in their hands. Delilah cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." Samson suddenly realized God's power had left him. He was powerless. The Philistines captured him, gouged out his eyes, put him in chains, and forced him to grind grain in prison. But before long, his hair began to grow back. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." The half-drunk people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can amuse us." So Samson was led from prison so they could jeer him. Samson said to the young servant leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them." The temple was full with about 3,000 people on the roof. Samson prayed to the Lord, Sovereign Lord, please strengthen me just one more time. Let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the two central pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." The temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So Samson killed more Philistines when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Samson had judged Israel for 20 years.